Alright, here's how it all started. My name's Joe, and I live in a small town in Louisiana. You'd think life here would be simple: family gatherings, fishing trips, and backyard barbecues. But man, the truth can hit harder than a fist. I was married to Bonnie for 12 years. She's the kind of woman who could walk into a room and own it. Charming, sharp, and always looking flawless. She worked as a manager at some local office, but her hours were all over the place. Meetings, she'd say, shrugging like it was no big deal. I never thought much of it, until those meetings started feeling off. Now here's where it gets ugly. My sister Susan's husband Rich and I had been tight for years. He was the guy you'd call for help with a flat tire or if you needed someone to grill the steaks just right. We were family, our kids played together, we vacationed together, the whole 9 yards. So when I started noticing Bonnie acting distant and catching Rich's truck in odd places, my gut twisted. I brushed it off at first. Who wants to believe that kind of thing about their own wife and brother-in-law? But then came the proof. One evening, an anonymous message popped up in my inbox. No words, just a video. I hesitated, but curiosity won out. What I saw, I'll never forget. Bonnie and Rich in his truck, parked behind the diner we'd all eaten at just a week earlier. The audio? Let's just say it was more than enough to make me want to throw my laptop across the room. I sat there frozen, while the reality of it slammed into me. My wife and my brother-in-law, together. I felt the heat rush to my face, my chest tightening like a vice. My first thought was to call her, scream at her, demand answers. But then I stopped myself. No, I needed a plan. Susan was the first person I called. Her voice shook as I told her what I'd seen, but she didn't seem surprised. Turns out she'd been getting her own share of suspicions: late-night work emergencies, bank statements that didn't add up, and that same nagging feeling in her gut. That night we made a pact. We'd work together to expose Bonnie and Rich for what they were. No screaming matches, no confrontations yet. Just cold, calculated action. Susan had a lawyer friend and we decided to start there. We needed to protect ourselves and our kids before anything else. Step 1 was locking down our finances and pulling the records. Step 2. Gathering evidence. If Bonnie and Rich thought they could pull this off under our noses, they were about to learn how wrong they were. Stay tuned. It only gets wilder from here. After that night, everything shifted. It was like living in a bad dream, but there was no waking up. Susan and I became a team, unlikely but determined. We had to play it cool, especially around the kids. The last thing we wanted was for them to sense something was off. Susan's lawyer friend, Carla, was a godsend. She wasn't just sharp, she was relentless. She dug into Rich and Bonnie's work schedules, comparing them to the times Susan and I suspected something was happening. The overlaps were almost too convenient. Business trips? Yeah, more like romantic getaways. Then there were the bank statements. Susan and I spent a night combing through them at her kitchen table while the kids watched a movie in the other room. I found transactions for restaurants and hotels in places Bonnie had no reason to be. Susan uncovered similar charges on Rich's accounts. They weren't even trying to hide it, which stung even more. The anonymous messages didn't stop, either. Over the next few days I got more videos and audios. Some were blurry or muffled, but the gist was clear enough. Bonnie and Rich were playing house while Susan and I were left holding the pieces of our families. At one point I asked the question that had been eating at me. Who do you think sent this stuff? Susan frowned, her eyes scanning the latest message. Someone who knows us, she said. Knows them. Maybe someone who works with one of them and got fed up watching their mess. Whoever it was, I was grateful. Painful as it was, I needed to see the truth. And the truth was like a brick to the face. I'd been living with a liar. Every I love you, every kiss goodbye in the morning, it all felt tainted now. The hardest part? Pretending everything was normal. I couldn't look at Bonnie the same way. When she laughed at the dinner table or kissed the kids goodnight, I had to fight the urge to call her out. She had no idea I knew, which gave me the upper hand, but it also felt like poison, eating away at me from the inside. Then one day, Susan dropped a bombshell. Her oldest, Emma, had overheard Rich on a phone call. He didn't realize she was home early from soccer practice. Emma had recorded part of it, sensing something was off. She brought the recording straight to Susan. When Susan played it for me, my blood boiled. Rich wasn't just talking to Bonnie, he was laughing about how clueless we were. Joe and Susan wouldn't see it if it hit them in the face, he said, followed by Bonnie's voice agreeing. Hearing them mock us like that? It lit a fire in me. Susan clenched her fists as the recording ended. We need more than this, she said, her voice tight. This is personal, but we need legal leverage. She was right. Carla advised us to keep collecting evidence. We needed to document everything from the money trails to their meetings. It felt dirty, like stooping to their level, but it had to be done. We bought small cameras and voice recorders. Susan and I worked out a system, tracking their movements without tipping them off. Every time Bonnie left the house, I checked the GPS on her car. Susan did the same with Rich's truck. They had no idea the walls were closing in. The tipping point came when Susan's youngest, Jake, stumbled on Rich's hidden phone. It was meant for his affair with Bonnie, filled with photos, texts, and even plans for future meetups. The kids weren't just bystanders anymore, they were on our side. And that's when I realized, we weren't just fighting for ourselves. We were fighting for our kids, their futures, and our dignity. But this fight was far from over. With Rich's hidden phone in our hands, the game changed. It wasn't just suspicions anymore, we had hard evidence. Susan and I scrolled through the messages late into the night, a mix of anger and disgust fueling us. They were reckless, calling each other pet names, sending photos, and openly talking about how they'd make it work once they left us. The nerve of it. Bonnie even joked in one message about how I'd probably never notice. That one hit me like a punch to the gut. How blind had I been? How many times had I trusted her while she was off with Rich? Susan's jaw tightened as she read over my shoulder. This is it, she said. This is what we need to nail them. Carla agreed. With the texts, photos, and videos, we had enough to confront them, but we weren't ready for that yet. Instead, Carla helped us map out our next moves, securing our finances, filing for divorce, and ensuring custody of the kids. Step 1 was draining the joint accounts. Susan and I acted quickly, pulling money into personal accounts they couldn't touch. Carla had warned us. People like Rich and Bonnie, once cornered, might try to grab what they could and run. We weren't giving them that chance. Next, we compiled a financial audit. Susan found out Rich had been stashing money in an offshore account. That discovery wasn't accidental. Her kids, Emma and Jake, had taken it upon themselves to dig through his files after finding the secret phone. They found bank statements tucked away in his home office, statements he'd been too sloppy to shred. Meanwhile, my kids weren't sitting idly by either. My oldest, Luke, had noticed Bonnie's frequent absences and started tracking her. He used an old phone of mine to monitor her location when she left for her so-called meetings. The moment he handed me the data, pride swelled in me. Our kids were sharper than we gave them credit for. Dad, Luke said one night, looking serious for a kid his age. We have to stop them. They're messing everything up for everyone. He wasn't wrong. As much as it broke my heart, this betrayal wasn't just between adults, it was tearing through two families. The evidence from Rich's phone revealed another bombshell. Not only were they sneaking around behind our backs, but they were also using company funds to fund their escapades. Hotel stays, fancy dinners, even flights, it was all charged to their respective jobs. That was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. With everything we had, Susan and I decided to escalate. We met with Carla and handed over everything: texts, financials, GPS logs, even the surveillance footage we'd captured of them meeting up. Carla's face hardened as she reviewed it all. This isn't just a betrayal, she said. This is fraud. We can take this to court and we'll win. But if we play this right, we can also hit them where it hurts before they see it coming. That's when we decided to time the blow perfectly. We'd file for divorce, lock down custody, and expose their workplace fraud all in one coordinated strike. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about protecting what was ours. But there was one more twist coming, one that none of us saw coming. Just when Susan and I thought we had everything lined up, an unexpected player entered the game. One evening, Susan called me, her voice barely above a whisper. Joe, you're not going to believe this, she said. I just got a call from one of Rich's co-workers. She knows about the affair. Turns out, a woman named Beth who worked directly with Rich had caught wind of his extracurricular activities. Beth wasn't just any co-worker. She was someone Rich had rubbed the wrong way for years. She told Susan that she'd seen Rich use company funds for personal expenses, but it wasn't until she overheard him on the phone with Bonnie that the pieces clicked. Why is she reaching out now? I asked, skeptical. She said she hates how smug he's been about it, Susan replied. Apparently he's been bragging to a few people at work about having it all figured out. Beth's been sitting on this for a while, but she's fed up. Beth wasn't bluffing either. She offered to share documents she'd been quietly collecting, expense reports, emails, even timestamps of when Rich would disappear from the office during meetings. Susan and I arranged to meet her in person to review the files. When we met Beth at a coffee shop the next day, she didn't hold back. She slid a thick folder across the table, her expression firm. Rich thinks he's untouchable, she said. But people like him always slip up. You just have to know where to look. The folder was a goldmine. Expense claims for luxury hotels and dinners, all filed under client meetings. Correspondence with Bonnie that was way too personal to be professional. There was even a memo from their boss questioning a few charges, which Rich had somehow managed to smooth over. What's in this for you? I asked Beth, still cautious. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Justice, she said simply. And maybe a little satisfaction. People like Rich think they can walk all over everyone. He deserves to face the consequences. With Beth's evidence, we now had a new angle. Not only could we destroy their personal lives, but we could also take them down professionally. If their employers found out about the misuse of company funds, it would be over for them. As we walked back to the car, Susan looked over at me. Can you believe this? It's like everything's falling into place. I nodded, but part of me felt uneasy. Yeah, I said. But we need to stay sharp. If Beth's this fed up, others might be too. If Rich and Bonnie catch wind of what we're doing. Susan sighed. Then we'll just have to be one step ahead. The next day, Carla reviewed the new evidence and couldn't hide her excitement. This solidifies everything, she said. It's not just personal betrayal anymore, this is workplace fraud. If their companies get involved, they'll be facing more than divorce court. It was a risky move, but Susan and I agreed to share the evidence with Rich and Bonnie's employers. Carla coordinated the anonymous tip-offs, sending the files to the HR departments with an anonymous email detailing their behavior. Now, it wasn't just about us anymore. The storm was brewing and soon they'd have nowhere to hide. But the fallout from our decision would take an unexpected toll, one that would test how far we were willing to go. It didn't take long for the dominoes to start falling. Just days after Carla sent the evidence to their employers, Susan called me, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and nerves. They know, she said. Rich was called into a meeting this morning. He hasn't come home yet. The same thing happened to Bonnie. Her boss summoned her to the office for a performance review, which was code for an ambush. I knew because I'd tracked her GPS and saw her car parked there for hours. When she came home that night, her face was pale, her usual smugness replaced with tight-lipped silence. Rough day? I asked casually, forcing a neutral tone. She didn't answer, just muttered something about work being stressful and went to bed early. I let her stew in it. If she thought she could lie her way out of this, she was in for a rude awakening. Susan, meanwhile, was dealing with her own storm. Rich eventually came home, slamming the door so hard the house shook. Emma texted me later that night, saying she'd heard him yelling at Susan, accusing her of setting him up. He knows, I told Susan over the phone. Let him know, she snapped. The only thing he can do now is dig himself a deeper hole. The tension in both households was palpable. Bonnie and Rich didn't know the full extent of what was coming, but they could sense the walls closing in. Then came the tipping point. Their companies launched internal investigations. HR wasn't playing around. The misuse of company funds wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Bonnie and Rich had been sloppy, leaving paper trails that Carla made sure their employers couldn't ignore. A week later, the hammer dropped. Susan called me, her voice shaking. Rich was fired, she said, almost breathless. They didn't even let him pack his desk. Security walked him out. Later that same day, Bonnie came home early, looking like she'd been through a war. She stood in the doorway, holding her purse like it weighed a ton. "What's wrong?" I asked, feigning concern. "They let me go," she said quietly, sinking into the couch. "Budget cuts." I almost laughed at the audacity of the lie. "Budget cuts?" "Sure, Bonnie." I didn't press her, though. Let her keep her story for now, it wouldn't matter soon enough. That night I sat with my kids, explaining as gently as I could that things were about to change. Luke, sharp as ever, looked me dead in the eye. "Is it because of Mom and Uncle Rich?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain this kind of betrayal to a kid? "It's complicated," I said finally. Luke just nodded, like he already understood more than I was saying. The fallout wasn't just professional, it was personal. Friends who had been close to both families started picking sides. Word got around, and people began distancing themselves from Bonnie and Rich. The perfect facades they'd built were crumbling fast. But just as we were starting to feel some sense of justice, Bonnie made a move I didn't see coming. She confronted me. It was late one night, the kids were asleep and I was sitting on the porch nursing a beer. Bonnie stepped outside, her expression unreadable. "Joe," she said softly, sitting next to me. "I know things haven't been great lately, but I feel like... I don't know. Like we've drifted apart." I nearly choked on my drink. Drifted apart. Was that what she called sneaking around with Rich for months? I played along, though. "Yeah," I said. "I've been feeling that, too." Her eyes searched mine as if she was looking for a way back in. "Maybe we can fix it," she said. "Go to counseling or something." I stared at her, my stomach churning. This wasn't guilt, it was desperation. She was losing her grip on everything and trying to claw her way back. "I'll think about it," I said, standing up and heading inside. But I already knew there was no saving this. And Bonnie wasn't done scheming yet. Bonnie's attempt to reconnect with me wasn't a genuine olive branch, it was a calculated move and I knew it. Over the next few days, she started acting overly attentive. Suddenly she was cooking meals, cleaning the house without a word, and even asking about my day like we were newlyweds. It would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic. The woman who'd been sneaking around with my brother-in-law was now trying to win me back with casseroles and fake smiles. At first I played along, keeping my true feelings buried. But her behavior became more obvious by the day. One evening she sat next to me on the couch, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. "I've been thinking," she began, twirling her wedding ring like she always did when she was nervous. "About us. About how we got here. Here it comes," I thought, bracing myself. "I know I've been distant," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "And I haven't been the wife you deserve. But I want to make it right, Joe. I really do." I almost admired the performance. She even teared up, letting one perfect tear roll down her cheek. But I'd seen the messages, heard the recordings, and watched the videos. No amount of acting was going to erase what I knew. "Let's take things slow," I said carefully, my stomach churning at the sight of her fake vulnerability. Bonnie seemed to relax, leaning back into the couch as if she'd just dodged a bullet. "I think that's a great idea," she said. "One step at a time." What she didn't know was that I wasn't stalling to reconcile. I was biding my time to deliver the final blow. Meanwhile, Susan was dealing with her own version of damage control. Rich, now unemployed and increasingly agitated, was trying to pin the blame on everyone but himself. He accused Susan of poisoning the kids against him, claiming that Emma and Jake had no right to go through his things. "They're not stupid, Rich," Susan told him flatly when he confronted her. "They see you for what you are." Rich stormed out of the house after that, but Susan didn't care. She was focused on finalizing her divorce plans. Carla had filed the paperwork for both of us, and we were gearing up for court. But Bonnie wasn't giving up without a fight. A few nights later, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of photo albums spread out in front of her. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes wide and hopeful. "Look at these," she said, holding up a photo of us from our honeymoon. Remember this? We were so happy back then. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We can be that happy again, she said softly, placing her hand over mine. That was it. I couldn't take the charade any longer. You think a photo album is going to fix this? I snapped, pulling my hand away. Bonnie's face fell, and for the first time her mask cracked. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice trembling. I know, Bonnie, I said, my voice cold and steady. About you and Rich. About everything. Her eyes widened, and for a split second she looked genuinely terrified. But then, like flipping a switch, she went on the offensive. Who told you that? She demanded, her voice rising. It's not true. I pulled out my phone and played one of the recordings. Her voice and Rich's filled the room, laughing and mocking me and Susan. Bonnie froze, her face draining of color. Joe, I can explain, she stammered. But I wasn't interested in explanations. Save it, I said, standing up. The lawyers will handle it from here. That was the first time I saw Bonnie truly unravel. And as much as it hurt, I felt a sense of relief. The truth was out and there was no going back. But the battle was far from over. Next stop, the courtroom. After I confronted Bonnie, things spiraled fast. She spent the next few days switching between denial, anger, and sobbing apologies. It didn't mean anything, Joe. She cried one evening. It was a mistake and I regret it every day. I didn't buy it. I'd seen too much to believe her lies. Meanwhile, Susan was dealing with the same circus. Rich was trying to worm his way back in, claiming he was pressured into the affair. Do you seriously think I'm that stupid? Susan shot back, slamming the door in his face. Bonnie, however, didn't give up so easily. One night, she cornered me in the living room. We can fix this, she pleaded. For the kids. I looked her in the eye. The kids deserve better than this, I said. She broke down, but I didn't stick around to console her. It was clear, Bonnie wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. The courtroom was coming and I was ready. With the confrontation behind us, it was time to focus on the next step, court. Carla worked tirelessly, building a rock-solid case for both Susan and me. Between the financial records, GPS logs, and incriminating messages, we had more than enough to prove the affairs and protect our kids. Bonnie tried to play nice, suddenly eager to mediate instead of going to court. Why drag this out? She asked one evening, her tone sweet but calculated. I didn't bite. We'll let the lawyers decide what's fair, I said, keeping my answers short and neutral. Rich, on the other hand, was openly hostile. He accused Susan of trying to ruin him, even threatening to fight for custody of their kids. Let him try, Susan said, her voice steady. We've got more than enough to bury him. Our kids stayed sharp too. Luke and Emma worked together to gather more details, like screenshots of Rich and Bonnie's hidden accounts. When they showed me the evidence, I couldn't help but feel proud. This is for us, Luke said. For all of us. The trial date was set and we were ready. It was time to make sure Bonnie and Rich couldn't lie their way out of this. The day of the trial felt surreal. Susan and I arrived early, sitting quietly in the waiting area while Bonnie and Rich showed up separately, avoiding eye contact with everyone. They looked tired, worn out. Good. Our lawyers laid out the case with precision. Carla presented the texts, videos, and financial records, painting a clear picture of the lies, infidelity, and misuse of funds. Bonnie's face turned pale as her messages were read aloud in court. Rich sat there, glaring at Susan like it was her fault he'd been exposed. When it was my turn to speak, I focused on the kids. This isn't just about betrayal, I told the judge. It's about protecting my children from the damage this has caused. Susan was equally firm, describing how Rich's actions had affected their home life and the kids' well-being. Bonnie and Rich's lawyers tried to spin it, claiming the evidence was circumstantial and that the kids would benefit from a stable two-parent environment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The judge wasn't buying their excuses. After reviewing the evidence, they ruled in our favor. Susan and I were awarded full custody of the kids, while Bonnie and Rich were left with limited visitation rights. Financially, they got the bare minimum, no hidden accounts, no loopholes. It was a win, but it came with a bittersweet feeling. The damage was done and there were no real winners in a mess like this. Still, I felt a weight lift as I walked out of that courtroom. It wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about moving forward. Leaving the courthouse felt like closing a chapter, but the fallout from Bonnie and Rich's actions was far from over. Word about the trial had spread in our small town. Friends and neighbors who once admired Bonnie and Rich were now whispering behind their backs. Bonnie moved into a small apartment across town. When she came to pick up the kids for her first supervised visitation, she looked hollow, like a shadow of the person she used to be. "Joe, can we talk?" she asked hesitantly. "There's nothing left to say," I replied, keeping my tone flat. The kids were polite but distant with her. Luke, especially, made it clear he wasn't ready to forgive. Rich didn't fare much better. He was staying with a distant cousin, jobless and bitter. Susan told me he'd tried reaching out to Emma and Jake, but they didn't respond. "They've seen the truth," Susan said. "They know what kind of man he is." As for Susan and me, we started focusing on rebuilding. We met regularly to compare notes on how the kids were adjusting. It was awkward at first, but over time it became almost routine. "Strange, isn't it?" Susan said one evening as we watched our kids play in the yard. "This mess brought us closer." I nodded, knowing she was right. Out of the wreckage we'd found a new sense of strength, not just for ourselves but for our families. Still, there was one loose end we didn't see coming. A surprise that would threaten to pull us back into the chaos. Just as life was beginning to settle, an unexpected twist pulled us right back into the chaos. One evening, Susan called me, her voice laced with frustration. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Rich is filing a motion to increase visitation rights. He claims the kids are alienated against him." I felt my blood boil. "He's the one who wrecked their trust, not us," I said. "What's he even hoping to get out of this?" "Control," Susan replied. "And probably revenge." It wasn't just Rich causing trouble. Bonnie had been trying her own version of damage control. She started showing up at Luke's soccer games and school events uninvited, pretending everything was fine. At first I ignored it, thinking she'd eventually get the message. But then one day she crossed a line. It was during Luke's championship game. Bonnie approached me during halftime, her tone dripping with fake cheer. "Isn't he amazing out there?" she said, gesturing toward the field. I didn't even look at her. "What do you want, Bonnie?" She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I just want us to be a family again," she said softly. "For the kids." I turned to her, keeping my voice low but firm. "The kids don't need you playing happy family. They need stability, and that's what I'm giving them." Her face twisted, the fake warmth replaced by cold frustration. "You're not being fair," she said. "You're turning them against me." "No," I replied. "You did that yourself." Bonnie stormed off, but the damage was already done. Luke saw the exchange and looked at me, his expression a mix of confusion and hurt. After the game, he stayed quiet during the ride home until he finally spoke. "Why does Mom keep showing up when she knows we don't want her there?" he asked. I sighed, gripping the wheel tightly. "Because she's trying to make things right in her own way," I said. "But sometimes, people don't realize how much damage they've caused." Luke nodded slowly, his gaze fixed out the window. "She doesn't get it, does she?" "No," I said quietly. "She doesn't." Meanwhile, Susan was dealing with Rich's legal antics. His motion to increase visitation rights was based on claims that Susan was withholding access to the kids and poisoning their perception of him. It was laughable considering the evidence we had of his betrayal and neglect. Still, it meant another round of court battles. Carla reassured us that the motion wouldn't hold up, but it didn't stop the stress from creeping back in. One night, Susan and I sat on her back porch, going over the details of Rich's motion. The kids were inside watching a movie, their laughter occasionally drifting through the open window. "I'm so tired of this," Susan said, rubbing her temples. "It's like he can't stand to let us move on." "He's trying to drag you down with him," I said. "It's all he's got left." Susan looked at me, her expression weary but determined. "I just want this to be over, Joe. for all of us. We'll get through it, I said. We've come this far. He's not winning this. But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that this fight wasn't just about visitation. It was about control, something both Bonnie and Rich had lost and were desperate to regain. The next court date was set, and we braced ourselves for another round. But little did we know, the chaos wasn't done escalating yet. Rich and Bonnie still had one last card to play, and they were about to throw everything they had into one final desperate move. The courtroom drama we thought was behind us came roaring back when Rich and Bonnie decided to team up. That's right, they joined forces, filing motions together to challenge custody arrangements for both families. Susan called me as soon as she got the notice, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "Joe, they're claiming we're unfit parents," she said, practically spitting the words. "What? Based on what?" I asked, pacing my kitchen. "They're saying we manipulated the kids against them, and they're claiming they can provide a better, united home environment." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. United? They've got nothing to show for that. "They're desperate," Susan said, her tone grim. "And desperate people make stupid moves." Carla wasn't worried, though. She assured us the case was flimsy at best, but that didn't mean it wouldn't be a headache to fight. Rich and Bonnie's strategy became clear during the preliminary hearing. They paraded around as if they'd magically become a picture-perfect couple, presenting themselves as a stable, loving unit. It was nauseating to watch. At one point, Rich's lawyer tried to argue that Susan had alienated their kids by allowing them to help gather evidence. She involved minors in adult disputes, the lawyer said. Susan, calm as ever, responded, "My children are intelligent enough to recognize the truth. I never forced them to do anything." Bonnie's lawyer was no better, accusing me of being overly controlling and emotionally manipulative. Bonnie even took the stand, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance about how she only wanted to rebuild a relationship with her children. When it was my turn to testify, I kept it simple. "Their behavior caused this," I said firmly. "Our kids saw it for themselves." Bonnie and Rich were more focused on each other than their families, and that's not something I had to point out. My children are smart enough to figure it out on their own. The kids' testimonies sealed the deal. Luke, Emma, and even Jake were clear and composed, explaining how they felt betrayed and how Susan and I had done everything to provide stability. "They lied to us," Luke said plainly when asked why he preferred staying with me. "They made their choices and now we're making ours." When the judge delivered the ruling, it was clear we'd won. Custody arrangements remained unchanged, and Bonnie and Rich's motions were dismissed. But the victory came at a cost. Bonnie and Rich left the courtroom humiliated, and their anger quickly turned toxic. Rich sent Susan a barrage of texts, calling her every name in the book and blaming her for everything. Bonnie tried to guilt-trip me, claiming she didn't deserve this and accusing me of turning Luke against her. I blocked her after that. Susan and I decided to focus on moving forward, but the bitterness from Bonnie and Rich lingered like a bad smell. They'd lost the battle, but they weren't ready to let go, and their next move would prove just how far they were willing to go to make our lives miserable. After losing in court, Bonnie and Rich's behavior became more erratic. They started showing up uninvited to events, making scenes that left everyone uncomfortable. It was like they couldn't accept that they'd lost control and were determined to claw their way back into the picture, no matter the cost. The first big blow-up happened at Luke's school fundraiser. I was there with the kids, enjoying the evening, when Bonnie appeared out of nowhere. She walked up to our table, plastering on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hi, Luke," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Luke barely looked up from his phone. "Hey," he muttered, not hiding his discomfort. I stepped in. "Bonnie, this is a school event. It's not the place for this." She turned to me, her expression shifting to something colder. "I'm his mother, Joe. I have every right to be here." "You weren't invited," I said firmly. "If you care about Luke, you'll respect his boundaries." She scoffed, looking around like she was waiting for someone to take her side. No one did. Eventually she stormed off, muttering under her breath about how I was poisoning the kids against her. Rich wasn't any better. He showed up at Susan's house one afternoon, pounding on the door until she answered. "What do you want, Rich?" she asked, blocking the doorway. "I want to talk to my kids," he snapped. "You can't keep them from me." "They don't want to see you," Susan replied calmly. "That's their choice." Rich's face turned red. "You've turned them against me," he said, his voice rising. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Susan didn't flinch. "I don't have to think anything, Rich. Your actions speak for themselves." Before she could shut the door, Rich tried to push his way inside, but Susan was ready. "If you don't leave, I'm calling the police," she said. That sent him backing off, but his threats continued via text for days afterward. Things reached a boiling point when Bonnie and Rich decided to go public. They posted a series of long, dramatic rants on social media, painting themselves as the victims. They accused Susan and me of manipulating the kids, lying in court, and destroying their reputations. Bonnie wrote, "I only ever wanted to love my kids, but Joe has poisoned them against me. I don't even recognize the man I married anymore." Rich's post was even worse, filled with accusations and thinly veiled insults aimed at Susan. Their plan backfired spectacularly. Friends and neighbors who knew the truth were quick to call them out in the comments, pointing out their lies and hypocrisies. Some even shared screenshots of the evidence we'd used in court, leaving Bonnie and Rich scrambling to delete the posts. It was embarrassing to watch, but it also made one thing clear: they were out of moves. The kids noticed their antics too. Luke showed me one of Bonnie's posts and rolled his eyes. "Why can't she just stop?" he asked. "Because she doesn't know how to take responsibility," I said. Luke nodded thoughtfully. "She's just making it worse for herself." He was right. Bonnie and Rich had alienated not just their families but the entire community. Their desperation to control the narrative had only cemented their downfall. As their worlds continued to crumble, Susan and I focused on rebuilding ours. But even as things started to settle, I couldn't shake the feeling that Bonnie and Rich might still have one more trick up their sleeves. Just when we thought Bonnie and Rich couldn't stoop any lower, they pulled their most desperate move yet. Susan called me one afternoon, her voice tense. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Bonnie and Rich are suing us for defamation." For a moment I was too stunned to respond. "Defamation?" I finally managed. "Based on what?" "They're claiming we ruined their reputations by sharing evidence from the trial," Susan explained. "Rich says it's why he can't get a job, and Bonnie's blaming you for her relationship with the kids. It was absurd and they had no chance of winning, but it meant more legal fees, more stress, and more time spent dealing with their nonsense." Carla wasn't worried though. She called it a last-ditch attempt to save face. "They're grasping at straws," Carla assured us. "They're trying to intimidate you into backing down, but the evidence is on your side." Still, it wasn't just about the lawsuit, it was the emotional toll of knowing Bonnie and Rich were still trying to hurt us. The kids, once again, were the ones who reminded us why we couldn't give up. One evening, Luke pulled me aside while I was going over paperwork for the case. "Dad, you don't have to let them get to you," he said. I looked at him, surprised. "I'm not letting them get to me," I said, though my tired tone betrayed me. Luke shook his head. "You're always working on this stuff. But you've already won. We're with you, not them." Hearing that hit me harder than any legal threat. Luke was right, we had won. The kids were safe and the truth was out. Bonnie and Rich could scream and sue all they wanted, but they couldn't undo what had already happened. The lawsuit dragged on for months, but it went exactly as Carla predicted. The judge dismissed it, citing lack of evidence and the overwhelming documentation from the custody trial. Bonnie and Rich were left with nothing but more legal fees and shattered reputations. When the ruling came down, Susan and I met for dinner to celebrate, not just the end of the lawsuit but the fact that we'd weathered the storm. "To moving forward," Susan said, raising her glass. "To never looking back," I replied. It wasn't just a toast, it was a promise. Even after everything, though, the fallout from Bonnie and Rich's actions lingered. Their attempts to rebuild their lives only highlighted how much they'd lost. And while Susan and I focused on healing, we knew the damage they'd done would take time to fully repair. But one thing was clear: they had no power over us anymore. With the lawsuit behind us, life slowly began to feel normal again. For the first time in months, Susan and I could focus on more than just surviving the chaos Bonnie and Rich had created. The kids were doing better too. Luke threw himself into soccer, and I made it a point to be at every game. After one particularly impressive match, he came over to me, grinning ear to ear. "Did you see that pass, Dad?" he asked, his excitement infectious. "I saw everything," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You were amazing out there." Meanwhile, Emma started volunteering at an animal shelter, finding comfort in taking care of the animals. Susan and I noticed she smiled more, laughed more, and seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Susan and I leaned on each other in those months. It wasn't romantic, just two people who understood each other's pain and shared the same goal: rebuilding their families. We coordinated schedules, shared parenting tips, and even started having family dinners with all the kids. One evening after dinner, Susan and I sat outside while the kids played in the yard. "Do you think they'll ever truly forgive them?" Susan asked, her voice soft. "I don't know," I admitted. "But they're resilient. They'll figure it out in their own time." Susan nodded, looking out at the kids with a small smile. "We all will." Bonnie and Rich, on the other hand, had faded into the background. Bonnie had taken a job in another town, and her visits with the kids became fewer and farther between. She'd tried reaching out a few times, sending long messages about how she'd changed and how she wanted to reconnect. I didn't reply. Rich wasn't much better. Word around town was that he'd moved in with a relative out of state and was struggling to find steady work. Susan occasionally got updates from mutual acquaintances, but she never passed them on to the kids. "They don't need to know," she said. "They've already moved on." And so had we. Months turned into a year, and the scars Bonnie and Rich left behind began to fade. There were still hard days, of course, questions from the kids, moments of doubt, but they became fewer and easier to handle. One day Luke asked me, "Do you think Mom regrets what she did?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I think she regrets losing you," I said honestly. That seemed to satisfy him, and he didn't bring it up again. As for me, I found peace in the small moments, watching my kids grow, laughing with Susan over old memories, and knowing that I'd done everything I could to protect my family. The betrayal had left its mark, but it hadn't broken us. And as I looked around at the life we'd rebuilt, I realized something. We were stronger for it. The chapter with Bonnie and Rich was finally closed. What lay ahead was a future I could face with my head held high and my family by my side.